now just move into the second segment of this first part of the talk, and introduce you to some of the things that we roboticists are doing about these ethical issues. Now, this rather busy graph here is a kind of roadmap, what I call a robo-ethics roadmap that I developed some years ago in order to, as part of my evidence to a 2016 parliamentary inquiry, a Commons Select Committee inquiry on robotics and AI. And what I wanted to do here was to show the link between ethics and trust. So you sometimes hear about trustworthy robots. Well, that's, I think, a mistake. We should not trust robots. Instead, we should trust, ideally, we should trust the manufacturers and the maintainers, the operators, and the regulators of robots. It's human institutions, human beings and human institutions that we trust, not machines. After all, machines can't be responsible. I mean, if your toast is burned, you don't blame your toaster. You don't hold the toaster responsible. I mean, you might feel as if you do, but you don't literally hold the toaster responsible if it burns your toast. And the same is true for robots. If robots go wrong, they cannot be held responsible. It's only humans, and therefore robot ethics is a human concern. So essentially at the heart of this graph, and I won't go through all of it, in fact there are papers that do go through this that I can refer you to, but this links ethics, the kind of thing I've been talking about, and emerging ethical principles, of which there are many, many ethical principles for robotics. Of course, the first and most famous were Asimov's Laws of Robotics, published in 1942. The first modern set of principles of robotics were published. In fact, I was part of the group that developed them in 2010, so just over 10 years ago. And since then, literally hundreds of sets of ethical principles for robotics and AI have been proposed. But of course, ethical principles are not practice. And you need other stuff to put those things into practice. And typically, that is it's the practice of ethical governance. It's the practice of responsible robotics. Now, ethics typically underpin standards, and I'm going to talk a little bit about standards in the next few slides. And standards, in turn, underpin regulation. So typically, you can't regulate an industry or a technology unless you have standards that set out how things should be done. And of course, if you have regulation, you also need regulatory bodies. And typically the work that those do, and even the fact that they exist, is an important subject of public engagement, because it's part of building trust in a technology that we understand and therefore trust the human processes of regulating and overseeing, if you like, the technology, including investigating accidents when things go wrong, which again, I mentioned before, is a particular focus of my current work, robot accident investigation, for which we have, I should say, no regulation or regulatory bodies at present. So let me just tell you a little bit about the first of the standards that I was involved in. So this was published in 2016, BS 8611. It is, we believe, the world's very first ethical standard in robotics. It's a guide to the ethical design and application of robots and robotic systems. Now, what is it? Well, it's basically a method for undertaking ethical risk assessment. Now, again, I could give an entire lecture on this, but I can refer you to papers that talk about this in more detail. So risk assessment is not a new process. It's something that, as an old-fashioned safety engineer, I've been doing all of my career, doing risk assessments for the safety of electronics or machinery. Ethical risk assessment is like regular risk assessment, except that it broadens the envelope of concern to include ethical risks as well as safety risks. It's a superset, if you like, of safety risk assessment. And BS 8611 sets out a set of distinct ethical hazards and risks, and also what you should do, what you could do to mitigate the impact of each of those risks. So advice, if you like, on how to minimize the risks, and also how to show that you've actually minimized those risks. And I'll just show you, just to give you a flavor of what's going on. This is a screenshot of one of the tables in the middle of BS 8611. And down the left-hand column, you have the ethical hazards, and you can see deception, I've mentioned. Anthropomorphization, I didn't mention, but it's clearly a risk. Privacy and confidentiality, well, those are clearly and uncontroversially ethical risks. Then we have lack of respect for cultural diversity and pluralism, very important. Robot addiction. Again, I don't have time to go into detail, but again, you could ask me about what I mean by that. So those are the hazards. The risk is the thing that might happen as a consequence of those hazards. That's the thing, the consequence of that hazard. And then we have some notes and some means of mitigating those risks. So more recently, in fact, in 2016, at the same time, the same year that 8611 was published, the IEEE, which is a very well-known, well-respected professional body for electrical and electronic engineers, the Standards Association, the IEEE Standards Association, which most of you will not have heard of, but you will certainly have heard of one of its most famous standards, which is Wi-Fi. So the IEEE Standards Association published and still publish the internet standards, of which Wi-Fi is one of them, IEEE 802.11 for the standards nerds among you. So in 2016, very, in a really quite radical and surprising move, because standards bodies tend to be very conservative, the IEEE launched this global initiative on the ethics of autonomous and intelligent systems. And you probably can't read this, but essentially the mission is to make sure that everybody involved in the design and development of autonomous and intelligent systems is empowered to prioritize ethical considerations so that these technologies are advanced for the benefit of humanity. That's really important. This is putting humanity, actually both human beings and the environment, at the very heart of the design of technology. So outputs so far from the initiative include this document on the left, which you can go and download. It's called Ethically Aligned Design. I recommend you look at it. It's free to download. It's a very comprehensive set of ethical concerns, far more than I've listed. I think there are around 150 in there, alongside recommendations and background and such like. It's a really interesting and comprehensive study. It's not a document that you could necessarily put into practice, but it underpins a whole bunch of new standards that are now being written. So P7000, for instance, a model process for addressing ethical concerns during system design. P7001, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, transparency of autonomous systems. This is a standards working group that I lead. P7002 is a standard emerging on data privacy. And in fact, here is a list of the standards, the so-called human standards that have spun out, or at least the standards development. So most of these are still in works in progress. P7010, though, has already been published. It's a set of well-being metrics. So in other words, ways of measuring how your AI or autonomous system actually impacts human well-being. And if you're concerned about human well-being, then you really ought to be able to measure it. So that's an important standard. It's the first one to emerge, published from the IEEE initiative. Now, P7001 is the one that I lead, and I, if you like, I've been championing transparency. And this standard is based on the simple proposition that it should always be possible to discover why and how an autonomous system made a particular decision. Now, those of you that are really into autonomous systems will realize that that's often quite difficult to do in practice. So it's quite a tough thing to write a standard on this. And we've been working on it for, for the best part of 5 years now. Although we are coming towards the end, I'm hoping that it will be published this year, 2021. In fact, P7001 isn't just one standard, it's like 5 standards in one, because we realized when we were starting to write it that we need a different set of transparency measures for different stakeholders. So if you're a user of a robot, an elderly person using a care robot, for instance, then you need to be able to understand what the robot is doing and why, but it's a different kind of explanation to the kind of explanation that the person who repairs it or tests that it's safe will need. So that would, safety testers and certifiers would need a much deeper level of transparency than users. Similarly, accident investigators, you can see I really am obsessed with accident investigation. Lawyers and expert witnesses will similarly require a different kind of transparency, and the public at large, because it's important that these are disruptive technologies. They're technologies that are and will be in our lives, and therefore it's important that all of us know at least a little bit about what these robots are doing and how they impact on society as a whole. So oh yes, and if you're interested at all in this, I have a paper. It's a short, only a 3-page comment paper talking and explaining these ethical standards in robotics and AI. And I'd be happy to send you a copy. The actual paper is behind a paywall, but I do have a preprint on ResearchGate, which you can find if you Google it. But I'd like to finish now with this first part of the lecture, talking about ethical governance. And this is really, I'm just quoting from a paper that I did with my Oxford colleague, Marina Jarotka, called Ethical Governance is Essential to Building Trust in Robotics and AI, published a couple of years ago, 2018. And we set out in that paper a number of pillars, what we call pillars for good ethical governance. So these are things that companies, designers, manufacturers, operators should do in order to help us to trust them in how they're doing it. So they should, for instance, have an ethical code of conduct so that everyone in the organization understands what's expected of them. And they should also underpin that, and this is very rare indeed in industry, with a mechanism for whistleblowers. So it's really, really important, I think, that people who come across unethical practice in an organization should be able to report that, to take it to their colleagues without fear of being reprimanded or indeed fired. Sadly, firing is something that we're actually seeing right now in huge AI companies that should know better, frankly. It really is quite shocking that AI ethicists are having a very hard time right now in industry, because often the things that they're saying really are very uncomfortable indeed to their employers. And I think that's a very great shame. I think it's important to provide ethics training for everyone in an organization. Ethics is rather like quality. it's not something you could do as an add-on. You can't just appoint an ethics manager and say, okay, now we've covered ethics. For ethics to really make a difference, it's something that everyone in the organization should know about, care about, and understand. You should undertake ethical risk assessments of all new products. This is the method that BS 8611 describes. I think it's such a powerful way of heading off ethical problems before they become real and dangerous, as it were, when a product is out in the market. And of course, it's also important that you should be transparent about your ethical governance. You should be able to show people what you're doing, perhaps by publishing an annual transparency report where you would where you would describe which ethical risk assessments you've undertaken and what the outcomes of those assessments were. And ideally, this should be a report that's been, as it were, vetted by an independent review body to make sure that it really is truthful. So I think that an organization that had these 4 pillars of good ethical governance, I think, is one that we might well be able to trust, or at least, trust indirectly, therefore, their robots. I really don't like the term trustworthy AI.